Imagine a time when a loaf of bread was as essential to the Roman Empire as gold itself. A simple grain subsidy program once kept an empire fed, but could it offer us valuable lessons today in the face of inflation? What if the secrets of ancient Rome could help solve some of the most pressing economic issues of our time? Let's dive deep into history to uncover the surprising lessons that could offer a solution to the global economic challenges we're facing right now. In modern-day economies, inflation is a complex beast, one that involves rising prices, decreasing purchasing power, and sometimes a sense of helplessness for the average person. Yet, if we look back to ancient Rome, we find a system that tackled a similar issue: rising grain prices through a powerful government intervention, grain subsidies. The Annona, as it was known, wasn't just about feeding the citizens. It was a strategic tool that helped maintain the stability of one of the world's most influential empires. While modern inflation is a multifaceted issue, could Rome's policies offer insights on how we can manage today's economic volatility? The Roman Empire's Annona was a government-managed system designed to ensure that Rome's citizens had access to affordable grain. It was one of the most vital aspects of Roman statecraft, as bread and grain were essential to Rome's urban population, which had grown exponentially. The term Annona originally referred to the grain supply, but over time it came to encompass a broader system of subsidies that included distribution of grain to the poor. The Roman state, through the emperor and its bureaucracy, played a direct role in controlling the grain supply. This state-sponsored system had profound social, political, and economic consequences. When food prices spiked, it was the Annona that kept the city's population from revolting. The emperor used this as a way to consolidate power, ensuring that the people remained content and compliant. But, as we'll explore, it was not without its challenges and complexities. Bread and grain were staples for the people of Rome, particularly for the lower and middle classes. In fact, the city's dependence on grain became so great that without it, Rome itself could fall into chaos. Think about the modern equivalents: oil prices, gas prices, or even something as simple as food prices today. When the price of wheat rose, the entire city was affected, as were the political stability and social order of the empire. Grain was seen as a social right. People expected it to be affordable and readily available, and the government used this expectation as leverage. The challenge Rome faced was how to manage supply and demand, especially when external factors like war, poor harvests, or trade disruptions led to grain shortages. The Roman government had a sophisticated system of storage, transportation, and distribution, all designed to smooth out the volatility of supply and stabilize the economy. But as we'll soon see, the Annona system wasn't just about making sure people didn't go hungry. It was a calculated economic move. Rome's economic policy on grain subsidies was an elaborate one. The state controlled every aspect of grain, from harvest to distribution. The first major form of intervention was the state buying up grain at market prices when it was abundant, storing it in large warehouses throughout the empire. When prices spiked due to shortages, the government would release the grain at fixed prices or distribute it directly to the citizens. But the Roman Empire didn't just stop there. It was also involved in regulating the cost of grain production. Farmers who sold their grain to the state received subsidies in return for guaranteeing a fixed price. This prevented the market from becoming unstable and ensured the state had enough grain on hand when things went wrong. For example, if a war disrupted trade routes, the grain reserves were used to mitigate the impacts on the capital city. The system was not without flaws. There were times when political leaders would manipulate the system to win favor with the populace. This led to periodic disruptions in the grain market, and sometimes the emperor's popularity would directly influence the efficiency of the system. Despite these issues, the basic principle of government intervention to stabilize food prices remained remarkably effective. Fast forward to today, and you might be wondering, how can an ancient practice from thousands of years ago inform our approach to modern inflation? The truth is, Rome's grain subsidies were about more than just feeding the population. They were about stabilizing the economy during times of crisis. This is where the lessons become more relevant than ever. We live in a world where inflation seems inevitable. Prices for everything from groceries to gas to housing continue to rise, and the middle class is feeling the strain. Central banks and governments have limited tools at their disposal to fight inflation. One such tool is to manipulate interest rates, but this can take months, if not years, to take effect, and the results are often unclear. This is where Rome's approach shines as a possible model. Rome didn't rely solely on external forces or abstract economic theories, it directly intervened in the market. Could governments today take a more active role in ensuring that essential goods, like food, remain affordable? Could grain, or its modern equivalents, be subsidized in times of crisis to prevent social unrest or political instability? The role of state-run subsidies, similar to the Annona, could help smooth out the sharp peaks of inflation and protect vulnerable populations. Inflation, as we know it, isn't just about prices rising. It's about the complex interactions between supply and demand, wages, production costs, and global markets. Today, inflation can be triggered by factors ranging from supply chain disruptions to changes in energy costs to geopolitical conflicts. But just as the Roman Empire had to respond to external factors like poor harvests, we too are subject to economic shocks beyond our control. What if governments had a similar level of control over essential goods like food, energy, or healthcare? While it's unlikely that we could replicate Rome's grain subsidy system in its entirety, there are ways that we could make interventions more targeted. For instance, during a period of high inflation or economic uncertainty, governments could step in to stabilize the prices of basic commodities, ensuring that people don't face the same kind of hardships the Roman poor once did. We'll explore the specific challenges Rome faced in sustaining its grain subsidies, the economic consequences of these policies, and how modern governments could avoid the pitfalls that led to the eventual decline of the Annona system. Stay tuned as we uncover even more fascinating lessons that apply directly to our economy today. We dove deep into the foundation of Rome's grain subsidies, known as the Annona, and how they served as a vital tool for maintaining social stability in the empire. We saw how the Roman state's direct intervention in the grain market was designed to control prices and prevent social unrest during times of crisis. But, as with any complex economic system, the Annona had its share of problems. We will explore the pitfalls Rome faced in sustaining the grain subsidies, the long-term economic consequences, and the lessons we can draw from it for modern-day inflationary pressures. Although the grain subsidies were essential for Rome's stability, they weren't without significant costs. Over time, the Roman Empire faced increasing economic strain due to the growing demand for subsidies, combined with the empire's declining resources. As the empire expanded, so did its need for grain, which had to be imported from various provinces, including Egypt and North Africa. But the logistics of maintaining a steady supply of grain across such vast distances were daunting. The cost of transporting grain, storing it in large warehouses, and ensuring its distribution to the population required an immense amount of resources. Over time, these costs rose, and the burden fell heavily on the Roman treasury. To fund the subsidies, the government relied heavily on taxation, which in turn placed pressure on the economy. Moreover, as Rome's imperial reach expanded, it increasingly relied on slave labor to cultivate grain. While this provided a cheap and abundant labor force, it also led to economic inefficiencies. The reliance on slaves for agricultural production created a situation where the Roman economy became less innovative and dependent on unsustainable practices. One of the key issues with the Annona system was how it became subject to political manipulation. Emperors who were eager to win the favor of the people would often promise grain subsidies during times of crisis or unrest. This political favoritism sometimes led to overspending and corruption within the system. Emperors would use the grain distribution to gain popularity, even at the expense of the empire's long-term economic health. For example, emperors often relied on the Annona to quell political unrest. In times of famine or crisis, the emperor would increase the subsidies to gain favor with the people. While this approach worked temporarily, it often led to deeper economic problems in the future. The reliance on short-term solutions to address long-term economic issues created a cycle of instability that contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire. Politicians also exploited the subsidies to placate various segments of the population, especially the urban poor. However, over time, this led to an unsustainable reliance on government handouts, ultimately weakening the economy and reducing the incentive for citizens to work or innovate. In many ways, this echoes modern concerns over welfare and the potential for over-reliance on government aid. By the late stages of the Roman Empire, the Annona system began to unravel. The empire was facing mounting military costs, territorial losses, and internal decay. The grain subsidy system, once a cornerstone of Roman prosperity, could no longer sustain the empire. As the empire fractured and the central government lost control over far-flung provinces, the grain supply became less reliable. Additionally, inflation played a role in the system's decline. As the empire faced financial strain, the government began debasing its currency, reducing the metal content in coins, leading to hyperinflation. This eroded the value of money, making it harder for the state to purchase grain. The once mighty and well-organized grain subsidy system began to crumble under the weight of economic mismanagement, political instability, and external threats. The final blow came as the Roman Empire was unable to maintain the necessary infrastructure for the grain subsidies. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, the Annona system came to an end, signaling the fall of the empire and the loss of its once stable economic foundation. The fall of the Annona system offers a cautionary tale for modern governments dealing with inflation and economic instability. While Rome's grain subsidies were designed to stabilize the economy and prevent social unrest, the long-term consequences of over-reliance on subsidies and government intervention should not be overlooked. Today, inflation is driven by multiple factors: supply chain disruptions, energy price hikes, and geopolitical events. Much like Rome, modern economies rely on subsidies to help manage prices. However, there is a fine line between using subsidies as a temporary solution and creating a system that depends on continuous intervention. In the case of Rome, subsidies were meant to alleviate short-term crises, but over time, they became a permanent fixture of the economy, undermining long-term stability. The central lesson we can draw from Rome's grain subsidies is the importance of balance. While government intervention is necessary during times of crisis, such as natural disasters or global supply chain disruptions, it should not become the sole method of dealing with inflation. Rome's reliance on subsidies made the empire vulnerable to external shocks, political manipulation, and economic inefficiencies. In modern economies, the temptation to use subsidies as a quick fix for inflationary pressures is strong, especially when governments are faced with rising prices for essential goods like food and energy. However, the key to avoiding Rome's mistakes lies in creating sustainable economic systems that encourage innovation and self-sufficiency, rather than relying solely on state intervention. One of the most critical factors that contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire was its stagnation in terms of technological and economic innovation. Rome relied heavily on agricultural practices that were dependent on manual labor, which led to inefficiencies. The lack of investment in new technologies and production methods meant that the empire couldn't keep up with the demands of its growing population. In contrast, modern economies benefit from technological advancements that help improve production and distribution systems. Innovations in agriculture, for example, have dramatically increased crop yields, making food production more efficient and less reliant on subsidies. Advances in transportation, communication, and logistics also make it easier to manage supply chains and stabilize prices. The key lesson for modern governments is that long-term solutions to inflation and economic instability don't lie solely in subsidies or price controls. Instead, we need to focus on fostering innovation, encouraging competition, and investing in technologies that will allow economies to adapt to changing conditions. This approach is more sustainable and can reduce the need for temporary economic interventions. Another lesson from the fall of the Annona system is the importance of diversification and economic resilience. Rome relied heavily on a single resource, grain, to maintain its economy. If the grain supply was disrupted, the entire system would crumble. Today, modern economies are vulnerable to similar risks. Whether it's oil, food, or rare minerals, economies that rely too heavily on a single resource are more susceptible to price fluctuations and supply disruptions. To build a more resilient economy, governments must focus on diversification. This means investing in a broad range of industries, technologies, and markets. By doing so, they can mitigate the effects of price volatility in any single sector, ensuring that the economy remains stable even during times of crisis. Fiscal responsibility is another area where modern economies can learn from Rome's mistakes. As the Roman Empire expanded, it began to rely more heavily on debt and inflationary practices to finance its government. Over time, this led to a collapse in the value of the currency and an inability to maintain the grain subsidy system. Similarly, modern governments today are facing rising debt levels and inflation, which can have serious long-term consequences. governments must balance short-term economic interventions with long-term fiscal responsibility. This means investing in infrastructure, maintaining low levels of debt, and focusing on sustainable economic growth. If done correctly, this approach can help avoid the pitfalls of over-reliance on subsidies and prevent the kind of economic collapse that contributed to Rome's decline. Rome's grain subsidies, though once a vital part of its economic strategy, ultimately contributed to the empire's decline. The lessons of the Annona system offer valuable insights for modern economies grappling with inflation. While subsidies can provide temporary relief, they should not be a permanent solution. Instead, governments must focus on fostering innovation, promoting economic diversification, and maintaining fiscal responsibility to build a resilient and sustainable economy. As we look to the future, it's clear that the lessons of ancient Rome can still inform our economic policies today. By drawing on the successes and failures of the past, we can create a more stable and prosperous future for all.